Thank you for joining us today at Homestead for Life. Today, we are making soap totally from scratch. So, how do we do that, right? So, for this recipe, our main ingredients are the tallow that we rendered, coconut oil, canola oil, our sodium hydroxide, and distilled water to make our lye. And then you can add whatever scents or colors or anything like that you like. I do suggest if you are adding scents or coloring, make sure they're made for soap or okay for soap, because sometimes they have a bad reaction. They'll change the consistency. My first soaps, I didn't know that, so they're a little clumpy and funky looking. They still work fine, but they are a little clumpy. So this is our recipe, and I will walk you through the steps. This recipe, so I kind of created it myself on soapcalc.net. So you can go on there and they have all the things you need to know kind of pre-filled for your different types of oils that you can use. So I played around with different oils that I had on hand to get the ratios that I want. So my soap is really high in cleansing and conditioning, not so high in the bubbliness and the foaming soap, like that normal soapiness that you're used to, but it does a good job with the cleansing and things like that. I've made several batches of this soap already. I really like it. So now we're going to try again. We're going to do another batch with you. So the first thing we want to do is get our oils heated up. So we have a scale because they are all measured by weight, not by volume. So we've got our scale zeroed out for this particular bowl. And we are going to use, 1 pound, 1 pound of our tallow, which of course doesn't want to come off the spoon. Come on, you can do it. This is why we have spatulas handy too. All right, we are up to a whopping 12 ounces. So a little bit more than we were able to fit in one jar, which is fine. Actually, maybe what I have left not on the stove is sufficient without having to go into a second full jar. Perfect. We're going to throw it off just a little bit because it's just not worth leaving that little bit in there. All right. So we're going to put all of that in our slow cooker. We're going to zero out our scale again. There's no getting every last trace of that out of there. And then 2 pounds we need of our canola oil. So hopefully we have enough. Okay, that finished that off, and we are right there. So that works. And then we zero it again, and then 1 pound of our coconut oil. This coconut oil is quite a bit more liquidy than the last coconut oil I had. Bought from the same place, but different brands. So trade-offs there. Okay, so we've got this, or we're going to put this if it's not already. Nope, it's off. So we're going to put this on low so it can heat up. And while we're waiting for this to heat up and before we get to mixing it, we are going to go and start on our lye solution, because we need the lye solution to cool down pretty dramatically before we mix it in to make our soap. Okay, so for your lye solution, what you need is your sodium hydroxide, and distilled water. Has to be distilled, okay? And when we mix these, we are going to be very, very careful because this chemical will burn and the fumes are horrible. So when we mix them, we're going to do it outside, but we're going to measure them in here. So soapcalc.net also tells you how much of each you need. And I'm going to put on my gloves before I do this. All the protective gear with this stuff. Probably shouldn't be doing it in shorts either, but it's Florida and it's summer. So we need 8.98 ounces of the powder. It's a little more dramatic than I feel like is necessary. Good grief. Okay. And for good reason, this stuff is child-proofed. All right, and then we have another bowl for our water. Zero the scale for that. Again, distilled water. And we need 24.3 ounces. That is a little bit too much of that. So we are just going to scoop a little bit out. Okay, that was actually perfect. Okay, so we're going to take these outside and mix them there because the fumes are terrible, terrible, terrible. So see you outside. Okay, so we are outdoors, so it doesn't fumigate my house. I've got a fan going. I've got my safety goggles. I've got my gloves. The other things to be aware of, make sure your dogs are not around. Make sure your kids are not running amok. Have I mentioned super, super dangerous? Burns, 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 stinks. If you stand over it while you're mixing it, it's going to burn your nose. So how we do this, we mix the powder into the water, never the other way around, okay? It's the powder stuff, the sodium, I already forgot the name of it. This is the stuff that's going to really mess with you. So we want this to dilute in the water, not the other way around, right? Because we don't need it all strong the other way. And you mix it until, ooh, and the fumes. You mix it until all the powder is dissolved, and then it'll start heating up. It's going to get really, really, really hot. I'm not sure if you can see the steam coming off of it already. So it's going to get really hot, and we need it to cool down to about 90 to 100 degrees before we can use it. So we've got it all good and stirred up. Now we got to wait for it to cool off and wait for our oils to really warm up, really. Okay, so our oils are mostly all melted, so we're going to mix them up a little bit. They are at 110 degrees, so we need them to cool down as well. So we're going to use a stick blender or immersion blender and pulse it smoothly. So you also want to tip it before you start. We want all the bubbles out that we can get. Of course, you can never get all of them. And then you've got some choices. So at this point, we can add our color, or we can wait until after we've mixed in the lye. It is entirely up to you. I will warn you that as you're adding your color, it's going to look like you need more and more and more and more dye. But after it kind of blends with the soap and does its whole chemical thing, the color gets much deeper. So You probably don't need as much as you think, but that's a trial and error adventure. So I'm making this batch green, because my last batch was purple. Not that they go together, but the last batch was colored more because I'm going to use it and I like purple. Whereas green is going to look like Irish Spring and my husband's going to be more okay with it. I have a lot of foam on the top, which doesn't hurt anything. Try and mix it in here. Doesn't hurt anything, but it is going to change the texture of your soap a little bit. You may have to cut it or scrape it off, depending on what you're going to use your soap for. If you're giving it as gifts or something, if you're going to sell it, you want the foam off. All right, so temperature-wise, we are at 118 degrees. So let's move this down. We've already moved it down to keep warm. And then I still have some flecks of the colored dye that don't look like they're mixed in. Do that. Okay. And then we pretty much wait for the temperatures to be right. They need to be within 10 degrees of each other, and they need to be between 90 and 100 degrees. So we've got some waiting to do. So the reason we want it between 90 and 100 degrees, I'm using the spatula to kind of pop the bubbles here as I can, if I can. The reason we want it between 90 and 100 degrees is because otherwise what's going to end up happening is you're going to blend your soap, you're going to get to trace, everything's going to be lovely and great. You're going to pour it in your molds, and then it's going to kind of volcano. And then it's going to settle back down and kind of just make a big mess of your molds. It's not going to look great. So again, depending on what you're using your soap for, if you're making it for you, cool. Who cares? It can be ugly. That's fine. But if you're going to gift it, if you're going to sell it, you probably don't want those things. So while you can mix it all up when they're both at about the same temperature and they're both, 130, 140, 150, absolutely, you can do it. There is not a soap police out there that's going to stop you. Will you regret it later? Yeah, maybe. Maybe. Again, depends on your purpose. Maybe not. Maybe it doesn't matter. All right, so our soap has cooled, well, our oil has cooled a bit, and so has our sodium hydroxide, our lye water. I guess it's just lye at this point. But I'm going to put this in a cool cup of water and get it that last 10 degrees down if I can, and then we're going to pour it carefully into our oils and finish this up and make our soap. We have our molds ready. Stir this up. Let it cool off some more in our bucket of cold water. Couple more degrees. So we want them within 10 degrees of each other, ideally. And we are about there. Awesome. All right, so very carefully, again, toxic, nasty stuff, right? So very carefully, we're going to take our lye and pour it and try very hard not to splash any of it. Pour it into our soap. Just go back in there, and then we just blend it up until we hit trace. So we're gonna use the Immersion Blender, then we're gonna hand mix around the edges. We wanna keep the Immersion Blender centered in the pot, don't lift it up or anything, and then we'll hand mix around the edges and make sure it's all incorporated. So one of the reasons we're not moving the Immersion Blender around a whole lot is because we don't want to get a bunch of bubbles. Okay, so all the stirring and the mixing, we may be here doing this for 5, 10, 15 minutes. It can take a little bit, but it's starting to get that kind of sheen on the top. So we're definitely getting closer. And I don't have as many bubbles on the top anymore, so yay for that. I'm also going to add some more of my green dye. So once I added the lye, it turned yellow. Not a shade of green, not a drop of green. And probably it's still fine. And once it's done, it'll go back to green. But a couple more drops won't hurt it. Okay, so we can start to see the trails. We are probably early stages of trace, so I'm going to still mix it up some more, but I want to scrape around the edges here. And make sure we've got it all well incorporated. And let's move the camera a little closer so you can see what I mean by trace. It's essentially being able to see the trails and the drips as you're mixing up your soap. That's how you know it's done, is you can see your trails. So you don't have to see them for terribly long. They don't have to stay there for 10 minutes. But you definitely want to be able to see them. All right. Unplug that bad boy. And get all our dishes out of the way. So we can pour our soap in our molds. So I'm going to ladle it in because this is a big heavy pot. And then I can pour it once it gets lighter and emptier. I'm interested to see what color this ends out to be because the oils were very, very green until we added in our lye. But it will change colors. The colors typically deepen while it's sitting in the molds. So we shall see. The color is always trial and error. Every time. It never comes out exactly how I expect it. And it's probably because even if I get exactly the color I want, I forgot how much I put in to start with. So I haven't ever actually learned those things. All right, one mold down. All right, so the process from here is easy. It's a bit time consuming. So our next steps are to leave this out on the counter for 24 hours. And then we are going to pop it out of the molds, slice it up, and let it sit on a cooling rack or wax paper or whatever you have for 4 to 6 weeks. So none of that is difficult. It's just time consuming. So we will follow this process and come back and check these and slice them up tomorrow. All right, our molds are full. Bang them down a little bit. Get all the creases off the top, at least some of them. And that's it. Now we wait them out. Our soap's had a couple days to dry, so we are going to take it out of the molds. Well, so out of the blocks first, and then out of the molds. And you don't have to use these molds. I got these off Amazon, but you can make your own. Obviously not the silicone part, but you can make your own and then line it with wax paper. And that'll work just as well. But with the silicone molds, just a little wet at the bottom here. And they've got time to cure, right? So these are going to cure for, it's actually the first time they've still been that wet after sitting in the molds for a couple days. But this is why they sit and they cure for 4 to 6 weeks. So we've got some time. All right. And you'll notice they are green. Not quite the green I was hoping for, but again, the color is always kind of trial and error on soap. I have yet to find, oh, very wet in the corner here, in my corners. But I've yet to find a recipe that gave you how much of the color to use. So, all right. So to cut it, I've got this lovely little soap cutter, and you can use your preference. I like the little cutter with the rigid edges, but you set the size and then you just slice your pieces down and set them on a rack to finish processing. And that's it. You just slide it, slice it, and you go down and you let it just sit somewhere dry, cool, dry, dark place. It's going to be right next to all my cans for 4 to 6 weeks. I usually leave them in there for a full 2 months so they're fully dry and have never had an issue. I will say I've never had them still be tacky like this, but they've also been sitting here for 3 days. I haven't gotten to them to pull them out to let them dry properly. So this might be a learning moment there. This is the 3rd time I've used this specific recipe and never had this. So, learning moment, take them out and slice them to dry after 24 to 48 hours, not at 72. But I am confident they are still going to dry and work perfectly well. They look fine. But that's it. So thank you for joining us today at Homestead for Life, and happy soaping. When we took our soaps out of the mold, which we're supposed to do at 24 hours, we took them out at about 3 days. So learned a valuable lesson. So when we took them out, the edges were still sticky and then got these air pockets in them. Like this, they kind of got stuck. They were still really soft and sticking to the mold, but they have all dried. So, I mean, they still do have a couple more weeks, but they're not goopy anymore. They're not soft anymore. So those pieces are ugly. I'll have to slice them off if I'm getting, well, I just won't gift that one. But the rest of these are still perfectly fine to gift out. They're still drying. It did discolor it a little bit. You can tell it's a little bit lighter on the sides that got goopy on the inside of the mold. But overall, they're still fine. But going forward, I will not be so lazy and make sure I take them out after 24 hours. So there was definitely a notable difference in the texture initially upon taking them out. So 24 hours is the time frame. Take it out of your mold, slice them up, set them out to dry. And then these have probably about 2 more weeks until they are ready to go. And that's it. That's soap making.